Hey class, today we're going to be learning about bonding. We're going to be looking at electrons and how they interact with one another. So this presentation is going to be covering a slight review of the periodic table, what valence electrons are, defining the 8 is great rule, and then differentiating between ionic, covalent, and hydrogen bonds. So first off, we got to do a little bit of review of the periodic table and looking at all the different elements that we have. One thing that I want you to know and remember is that the periodic table is broken up into 3 different groups. We have metals, nonmetals, and metalloids. Really, one of the things that you need to focus on is that metals are found all over here and nonmetals are found over here. The only nonmetal that doesn't follow that rule is hydrogen. But again, just remember that hydrogen kind of follows its own rules. But metals are going to be over on this side of the periodic table, and nonmetals are going to be over here. Metalloids we're not going to worry about as much. We're definitely going to be looking at more metals and nonmetals. When we look at an element, there's a couple different things that are listed within each box. We have an atomic number, we have a symbol, and atomic mass. The big thing that we're going to be focusing on is we're going to be looking at atomic number. We're going to be looking at number of electrons specifically, as well as number of protons. So atomic number actually means the number of protons, and again, protons are positively charged subatomic particles, but it is the same number as electrons, which are the negatively charged subatomic particles. So again, protons positive, electrons negative. And you're going to be able to tell how many there are by looking at this atomic number for each element. So in this case, hydrogen has an atomic number of 1, meaning 1 proton and 1 electron. Speaking of electrons, let's talk about what valence electrons are. Now, valence electrons are going to be the main players in the different types of bondings that we're going to be talking about today. Now, we just said that the atomic number shows the total number of electrons. That's going to be different than what the valence electron number is. So valence electrons are going to be the outermost electrons for a particular atom. So if we look at this atom, we have these different energy levels, but then we have this one energy level that is on the outermost I guess circle or edge or ring, however you want to say it. But in this one, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 valence electrons or electrons in the outermost shell. Now, that's not the same as the total number. If you look at this, there's a lot of other electrons in there. They're just not on the outermost shell or circle or energy level of this atom. Thankfully, the periodic table is actually laid out in a very convenient way for us to understand how many valence electrons there are. In each column, except for this middle area, these tend not to follow the normal pattern, and thankfully for us, we're not really going to be dealing with those elements. But if we look, each column has a specific number of valence electrons. So for the first column, it's 1. For the second one, it's 2. Third one, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And if I were to predict how many there were, I could look at a periodic table that has the elements filled out and say I look at carbon. Now, if I look at this number right here and it tells me the atomic number, I know that in total there are 6 electrons in this element. But if I look at the column, there are 4 valence electrons in this element. Oxygen has 6 valence electrons, but 8 electrons total. Lithium has 3 electron total, but only 1 valence electron. So again, valence electrons and total electrons are 2 different numbers. Now, when we talk about numbers, there is a number that we're going to target or focus on during this unit. We're going to be looking at 8 is great. Now, that's what I call it. I don't know if that's the actual technical rule name for it, but we are going to be focusing on what we're trying to accomplish with bonding. So when we're making these different bonds, what we're trying to accomplish is we want elements to be stable, and that number that helps it be stable is to have 8 valence electrons. And we achieve this by doing the different types of bonding. Now, if we come over here, noble gases are in this column right here. They already have 8. So they're actually not going to be doing any bonding, but we're going to gain, lose, or share electrons in order to get to that 8 is great. Now, depending on what's easiest, that's kind of what the element's going to do. So for instance, this group over here has 1 valence electron. Is it going to be easier to gain 7 or lose 1 or share 1? So you kind of have to look at how many valence electrons there are of whether it's going to gain, lose, or share. So if I'm over here, it's easier to share 2 or lose 2 than it is to gain 6 more or share 6. So just know there is a little trick to that, but we're trying to get to 8. So if I have one valence electron here, I need 7 more. If I have 2 valence electrons here, I need 6 more. The ones that are here with 4, they can either gain or lose or share 4. So that one's going to be kind of that little midpoint where it's kind of like, what am I going to do? I have 4 and need 4 more. But then here it'd be easier to gain 3. Here it'd be easier to gain 2. Here it'd be easier to gain 1 than lose 6 or lose 7. So that gets us into the different types of bonding that we have, and there are 3 that we're going to be focusing on. The first one is going to be ionic bonding. This is actually where we have transferring of electrons, so it's not going to be sharing, it's actually somebody's going to gain and somebody's going to lose electrons in this type of bonding. It tends to be between metals and nonmetals, so it tends to actually be on elements that are on opposite sides of the periodic table. When this type of bonding happens, we end up getting something that's called an ion. An ion is something that has a slight charge, because if you think about it, if I am losing an electron, I'm losing something that's negative. If I'm gaining an electron, I'm gaining something that's negative. So we end up with ionic bonding having ions being formed, where you end up having an atom that ends up having a charge on it. So an example of this is actually table salt. We have sodium and we have chloride. So sodium has 1 valence electron, chloride has 7. It's easier for sodium to give up, and it's easier for chloride to gain. So what that means is that we end up with a slight charge of a positive on the sodium and a slight negative on the chlorine. But again, that is a transferring of electrons. Covalent bonding is actually where we have sharing of electrons, and the way I remember this is sharing is carrying. Carrying starts with a C, covalent starts with a C. So in this case, what we're actually going to do is we're going to share electrons, and this tends to happen between 2 nonmetals or the same element. So the actual example I have here is I have 2 hydrogen bonds, or 2 hydrogen atoms, sorry, that are bonding together, and they're going to just share those 2 valence electrons. Now again, hydrogen is different since it only has 1 valence electron. It's happy with having just 2 valence electrons. Still remember, 8 is great. For everybody else, we're trying to get to 8 valence electrons. What's unique about covalent bonding is that we can have polar versus nonpolar. So polar ends up being uneven sharing. So you can think of this somebody still sharing, but they're hogging the electrons. This would be between something like oxygen and hydrogen. In water, oxygen is a much bigger atom or element than hydrogen, so it tends to be greedy and it tends to hold on to those. It still shares, it just holds on to those electrons a little bit more. Nonpolar is going to be even sharing, so they evenly share. They're the same electronegativity, meaning that they're just going to share them equally. So it just kind of depends on what element's being involved, but again, the whole desire behind this is to get to 8 valence electrons, stable bonding. It's just whether or not we share those evenly or we share them unevenly. The last type of bonding we're going to talk about is actually bonding that we've talked about before. It's hydrogen bonding. We talked about this with DNA. They are weak bonds that can be temporarily broken. It tends to be between hydrogen and another element that is slightly charged. In this one, you're actually not involving electrons. This can be found again in DNA and between water molecules. So if you look here, there's actually no electrons being involved. It's just hydrogen is being attracted to this oxygen who's slightly negative. So again, these are weak bonds that can break, so that's why with water, when it evaporates, you're actually breaking those hydrogen bonds. And then if you have water cool again to form liquid water again, you actually end up with those hydrogen bonds reforming, and then we get the liquid water that we know. So that's all I really wanted to review with bonding. There's 3 types that we're going to focus on in this class to help us kind of understand when we talk about biochemistry in our next little bit, as well as the properties of water.